Hello, I'm Thalie Martini, CEO of Breast Cancer UK, and welcome to the Be Well podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking to an award-winning investigative journalist who specialises in environmental health, and she's written on these issues in numerous US publications, including The Washington Post, CNN, Women's Health, and Environmental Health News. Now, environmental health is especially relevant for us at Breast Cancer UK because of the work we do in understanding and raising awareness of the potential links between hazardous environmental chemicals and breast cancer risk. So my guest today has recently published a book on how our so-called war on cancer can't be won without a new approach to cancer prevention that at its core tackles the impact of chemical pollution on our health. Her book, aptly titled A New War on Cancer, gives us a stark insight into the state of chemical pollution in the US, but also underlines the power of grassroots movements in effecting change. I'm delighted to welcome Kristina Marusic. Now, as you'll know, Kristina, we are big fans of your work, which is why we selected your book as one of Breast Cancer UK's Books of the Year. And I'd like to confess at this point that it was actually my pick because I feel your book is so important, and that's because it brings this urgent conversation to a wider public, which is something we know is actually really hard to do because cancer prevention and chemicals in our environment are both fairly intangible things. So could I start by asking you to tell me what it was that prompted you to write this book?
My younger sister Abby was diagnosed with thyroid cancer when she was 23 years old, which is very young for a cancer diagnosis. It really caught our family off guard. And at the time, her doctors mentioned that thyroid cancer tends to have a genetic component, tends to run in families, but no one else in our family had ever had it. And, one of her doctors said in this kind of offhanded way, there may have been something in the environment involved. But when we tried to ask questions about that and follow up and get more information, the doctors really didn't have much to offer. They didn't really know how to talk about this issue. And when we went kind of digging on our own, we also found it difficult to find answers. And I'm an investigative journalist, so I brought this question into my work. I wrote a series for Environmental Health News about cancer rates in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, where my sister and I live, and some of the disproportionately high rates of cancer that we have in this area and the environmental factors that are specific to this region that may be contributing to those disproportionately high rates of certain types of cancer, including thyroid cancer. And that series was called Prescription for Prevention. It won a couple of awards, and I got a really nice note from an editor at a publisher that focuses on books about the environment saying, congrats on these awards. Would you have any interest in turning this into a book with a bigger scope, kind of looking at this issue nationally and internationally? And so for five very long years later, including a pandemic in the middle, that's where the book came from. So my initial interest in this topic was really personal, as I think many people's are. So many of us are touched by cancer in some way. And then, I really started digging into it through my work, which is what led me to the book.
Yeah, so it seems that your personal experience, but also your professional interest kind of led you to create this book, which, I realized reading it that much of it happened during the pandemic as well. So a difficult time to write that kind of book. So, Kristina, studies show that global cancer incidence rates are rising. With breast cancer, actually, more of us are likely to develop the disease as well in our lifetime now. And of course, the good news is that we are seeing improved survival rates compared to previous generations, but the number of people being diagnosed doesn't seem to be falling. Now, you've named your book The New War on Cancer, which sounds quite radical. But can I ask, what is the old war on cancer and why does it need to change?
When I think of the way we've been fighting the war on cancer so far, we've devoted the vast majority of our resources into improving treatments for cancer and searching for a cure for cancer. And that work has been really vital. Those advances in treatment saved my sister's life, and I'm so grateful that they exist, and I would never say that we should do less of that. But what I am saying is that even though we've gotten much, much better at treating cancer than we used to be, people are also getting more cancer than have historically, and people are getting cancer at younger and younger ages than in the past. And surviving cancer is really difficult. Surviving is kind of not an ideal goal, right? Because we can do better than just survival. Surviving cancer often leaves people with lifelong health effects that result either from having cancer or from the treatments they get for the disease. People also have a lot of emotional hardship. It's really traumatic for people and families to receive a cancer diagnosis and then go through treatment. And people often have, what they describe as like PTSD when they have to go in for follow-up scans. I know that's something that I've watched my sister go through. And when I was thinking about this, as I started working on the book, and thinking about this framework we use, this language of a war on cancer when we describe all the investment we've thrown toward finding a cure and improving the way we treat the disease, it occurred to me that if this was, a literal war, I should back up, sorry. So right now, globally, only 7 to 9% of all cancer funds go toward prevention. All the rest of the money allocated toward cancer go toward treatments. And so one of the reasons we're not doing a great job at preventing cancer is because we just don't fund cancer prevention in a meaningful way. And when I started thinking about the way I wanted to frame this book, I realized that if this was a literal war, this would be the equivalent of spending only 7 to 9% of our war budget on offensive or defensive measures that could stop people from getting hurt in the first place, and like 93% of our resources on treating soldiers who came back wounded from the battlefield, which is obviously not an effective strategy, right? Not an effective strategy for a war. So my idea of a new war on cancer is one where we allocate a lot more resources toward preventing people from getting the disease in the first place.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense. And put that way, it really doesn't make sense, does it, to put all of our resources into dealing with the problem once it's happened rather than trying to avoid it as much as we can. And there's been a recent study done in the UK as well about the true cost of cancer. As you say, it's incredible really how far we've come with breast cancer. If a breast cancer is caught early, there's a really good chance that someone's going to make a full recovery. But that's via the whole treatment pathway, which can be expensive and traumatic and has a huge impact on people's lives. And there's a real cost to it. And in the UK, the NHS bears the brunt of it, and that's something that is very difficult to manage. And one thing at Breast Cancer UK is that we fund research and we produce resources to help people understand how to reduce their exposure to chemicals. It's one big area that we're interested in when we're looking at breast cancer prevention. But it's a really difficult question and a very difficult conversation to have, and primarily because it's really complex. Most people don't know what endocrine disrupting chemicals are, what chemicals are in the environment in their products. And in fact, they believe that those products that they buy, and why wouldn't they, and the environment in which they live in is safe because governments would, of course, be ensuring this, right? But it isn't that simple, is it? So maybe for our audiences, could you explain firstly what endocrine disrupting chemicals are, what these chemicals are, and how we've got to the place now where these chemicals have become such a normalized part of our life?
There are lots of chemicals, as you mentioned, that we come into contact with in the course of our everyday lives that are increasing our cancer risk. And endocrine disrupting chemicals is one class of those chemicals that is particularly widespread. particularly ubiquitous. We kind of run into endocrine disrupting chemicals everywhere. And these are chemicals that disrupt our body's natural hormonal processes. So examples of endocrine disrupting chemicals that people might have heard of are things like bisphenol A or BPA. Here in the US, you'll see lots of plastic bottles for sale with a sticker on it that says BPA free, but we've also learned recently that the replacement chemicals that are used for BPA in those products are also endocrine disruptors and are probably equally harmful. Other endocrine disrupting chemicals are PFAS or forever chemicals, and phthalates and parabens. There are lots more. It's a really huge class of chemicals, but those are the ones that you might see. I think they're on some people's radar because you might see a product in the store that says phthalate free or paraben free or BPA free. And endocrine disrupting chemicals are linked to a lot of negative health impacts, including increased cancer risk. They're also linked to reproductive problems, obesity, reduced vaccine effectiveness in children in particular, and a long list of other health effects. And when it comes to cancer risk, endocrine disrupting chemicals are suspected of increasing the risk of especially cancers that involve hormones. So breast cancer, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, ovarian cancer. They're really tricky to regulate because they don't work like most toxic chemicals where the dose makes the poison, which is kind of the foundation of toxicology. And scientists have learned that with these chemicals, sometimes actually a very, very low dose of an endocrine disrupting chemical has an effect that you don't see at a much higher dose. So for example, there's a whole class of these chemicals that's referred to as obesogens, and at very, very low doses, they turn on signals in our body that cause weight gain and make it more difficult to lose weight. And at higher doses that are typically used for toxicity screening, they don't have that effect. They don't do anything. So when regulators are using the kind of standard tests for these, they start at a dose they think is high enough to cause a kind of acute harm, and they say, oh, this looks fine, but actually it turns out that at much lower doses, it's causing these kind of subtle hormonal signals that then can cause really big problems, when we all have these kind of off hormonal signals that are telling our bodies to do things they shouldn't be doing. So that's really unusual and it's challenging to study. And it's one of the reasons these chemicals are so underregulated and have become kind of so widespread in the products we use, because, scientists are just kind of figuring out how to look for these effects. And then it takes a while for that science to translate to meaningful regulations.
Yeah, and it's that time and that delay, isn't it, in the science translating into policy, which is particularly problematic. And actually, at Breast Cancer UK, we believe firmly that the most effective way to reduce this exposure and to deal with the chemicals is through good policy. That actually protects people now, even though we don't exactly know how these chemicals are harming our health, because that's the reality of where we are when it comes to science. And we don't know how exactly it can lead to cancer. So here we call it the precautionary approach. And actually at Breast Cancer UK, we've been pushing this for 20 years. Now, in your book, you make a really compelling case for the precautionary approach. And you look at another health problem, actually, and I was fascinated to read this, and it's a little understood health problem, and that's the case of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, also known as cot death. And the SIDS case shows that using a precautionary approach can save lives, even though we don't fully understand why or how. So maybe can you talk to us a bit about this example to help explain the problem with both US and UK's approach to managing the risk of chemicals in our health?
I also think this is a really compelling example of another time where we've used the precautionary approach in public health, even though science didn't have all the answers at the time. So in the 1980s, there was a study done in Hong Kong that showed that babies in Hong Kong were less likely to die of SIDS. And they also observed that it was a cultural norm to have babies sleep on their backs in Hong Kong, whereas in other parts of the world, it was, more kind of standard to have babies sleeping on their stomachs. And it was, a single study, but as a result of that single study, a handful of other countries said, we're going to try advising people to have their babies sleep on their back and see how this goes. And so a handful of other countries, including the Netherlands, implemented a public awareness campaign telling people to put babies to sleep on their backs. And they also saw a steep decline in SIDS as a result. And when there was a big debate in the scientific community in the United States between scientists who said we should go ahead and do this in the United States because we still don't know why. They have no idea why, and there are lots of researchers all over the world trying to figure out the question of what exactly is different about babies sleeping on their backs that makes them less likely to die of SIDS, and the answers were unclear, and they were arguing with a group of scientists who felt really strongly that it was not appropriate to tell the public to change their behavior until we had really clear answers, until science had solved this question and we knew why this was happening. Luckily, the scientists who said, we don't have to know why, we have observed that this is true, so we should let people know, they won the debate, and the United States launched its Back to Sleep campaign I think in the late 80s or early 90s. And over the next 50 years saw a steep decline in SIDS cases, like a 50% drop in SIDS cases. And today, we still do not know why. Science has still not figured out exactly why having babies sleep on their backs makes SIDS less likely. So if we had waited until science had all the answers to that question, we would have needlessly seen many, many thousands of babies die of SIDS. And so, using the precautionary principle, letting people know that even though there was really limited evidence in the scientific community about whether this would continue to be true and why exactly it was, we saw that these kinds of public health initiatives can be really effective. And right now we're at the same place as we were back in the 80s with SIDS, with childhood cancer in particular, but actually we have much, much more evidence about specific risk factors for childhood cancer to start making decisions about preventing exposure to chemicals in the environment that are raising kids' risk for developing childhood cancer.
And so why is it that in the US and to some extent in the UK, the precautionary principle isn't adopted?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it comes down to, in the United States, we tend to let companies introduce whatever chemicals they want to the market, and then if it turns out they cause problems, the problems are addressed through lawsuits after the fact.
Right.
We see a lot of that happening now with things. We have lawsuits against pesticide companies for cancer. We have lawsuits against Johnson & Johnson baby powder that was contaminated with asbestos causing cancer. And then eventually, if the lawsuits are big enough, companies either kind of voluntarily change their practices, and that ends up standing in for a regulation, or sometimes a regulation comes after the fact. But, certainly if you ask any of the people involved in those cases, they would have rather had prevention than anything they recovered in a lawsuit, especially if it's over the loss of a loved one. And I think the driving factor is industry and economics, right? That we kind of prioritize making things easy for manufacturers rather than protecting consumers in a meaningful way.
And there is something in the fact that consumers there's convenience in a lot of the products that they've got. You know, these chemicals help make these products more convenient, and also there's a lack of visibility, so there isn't a concern in the public, and therefore there isn't a strong enough kind of, I suppose, reason for manufacturers to change their products, which I think is probably part of the problem that you actually address in your book. And actually, your book is full of wonderful interviews with remarkable people who are scientists, researchers, breast cancer survivors, and they've all contributed in their own way to progressing cancer prevention in the US. And these stories are truly inspirational. One of them, whose name is Ami, a scientist who studied EDCs for her PhD. Now, she talks about 4 main ways of reducing people's exposure to these chemicals. And she says, I quote, educating consumers, shifting marketplace demands, changing policies, and also challenging social norms related to beauty. So that's quite interesting. Which of these do we have the most control over? And can you maybe share some successful examples of these from your book as well?
I think we have the most control over what products we purchase and use as individuals, right? I think, as you mentioned earlier, policy is really critical, and I think we tend to have an overemphasis on individual consumer behaviors because it feels more accessible than changing policy. And one thing I really try to emphasize in the book is that all these people I interviewed who have devoted their lives to this work and this issue, I heard over and over again that we can't shop our way out of this problem. It's just too big, and that even if you have a PhD in organic chemistry and you're an expert like Ami and you work on this issue every day, you just can't actually make all the right choices to completely avoid chemicals that raise your cancer risk. And it's also not fair to ask consumers to do that, which is why I think it's really important that we all learn how to push for policy changes and feel empowered to demand better policy. That said, it can be scary and feel overwhelming to learn all of this and suddenly feel like the world is less safe than you thought it was. And I think it's really important to also empower people to make individual choices that can make them feel better in the meantime while we all work together to push for better policy, right? So I do think, we kind of have the most control over what products we buy and what food we eat, and that's where we can make some changes that can help lower our overall cancer risk from these chemicals. But I wouldn't want people to do that and then not feel compelled to also push for systemic changes, better policy that will protect everyone. Because, it's also not everyone has time or resources to make those individual lifestyle changes, right? We should be able to go to the store and assume that anything we can buy is safe for us and for kids and is not raising our cancer risk. So in terms of, you asked for some examples. Are you thinking about some of those like personal changes, or do you have?
I'm interested in some of the examples of the stories in your book, actually. So the stories that are shared by, I think you've got one person called Berry, and she's got a very interesting story because of her own personal experience of breast cancer and what led her to take action in all sorts of ways that kind of built into a bit of a grassroots movement. And she's just one individual who felt that her life was probably impacted by the chemicals that she was surrounded by in her youth, and how she responded to that.
Berry is a young woman who was diagnosed with breast cancer right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And she grew up in a town called Oil City, Pennsylvania. That's not too far from where I am in Pittsburgh. And it is the birthplace of the American oil industry. So it's where, if you ask someone in Oil City, they'll say it's where the first oil well in the world was discovered. But there had previously been oil found and drilled for elsewhere. It was certainly the first one in the U.S., and it was one of the very, very early oil wells. And so as a result, Barry grew up kind of surrounded by refineries and oil and gas infrastructure. There's a part of town where, as she was growing up, she remembered the smell, that it just smelled awful, the smell of these oil refineries, and that there was talk in the community about how everyone who lived in that part of town got cancer. And so she thought of that right away when she got her diagnosis. She also, like many people, when they get a cancer diagnosis, suddenly thought, started blaming herself for all the ways she might have increased her risk. She said, well, I smoked some cigarettes in college, and maybe I don't exercise enough. And she's an artist, and she thought maybe I haven't worn the right protective gear when I've been painting. And it made her feel really guilty. It made her feel guilty and worried that she had somehow brought this on herself. And I think that's one challenge with, I mentioned that very little funding goes toward cancer prevention, and the funding that does go toward cancer prevention almost exclusively focuses on lifestyle factors like eating healthy, not smoking, and exercising, and very rarely mentions the systemic issues that contribute to our cancer risk that we've been discussing. And that can be really, it's kind of dangerous, because I spoke with one oncologist for the book who had just spoken with a young man who lived a super healthy lifestyle. He was a long distance runner, and he ate really clean and organic and healthy. And he was shocked and then furious when he got a cancer diagnosis, because he felt he had been told that he could control his cancer risk through his behaviors. And he felt that that was a lie, right? He was like, I was told that if I made all the right choices, I was capable of preventing myself from getting cancer, which turned out not to be true. So it's a really fine line between empowering people to take steps that can help reduce our overall risk. And then again, like I said, putting this emphasis on, shouldn't we have policies that mean that people don't grow up in towns where that everyone from this one part of town is likely to get a cancer diagnosis because of a company that operates its business there. So some of the things that Barry did that made her feel a little more empowered as she was going through her treatment were to swap out her personal care products for non-toxic alternatives to, things like her makeup and shampoo and lotion and skincare. She also had all of the ductwork in her home cleaned. She started filtering her water. She started periodically running an air filter because she lives in Pittsburgh now, where I live, and we have a lot of ongoing problems with industrial air pollution here. And taking some of those proactive steps helped her feel a little more empowered. And then she also started thinking about some of these systemic issues and how we can push for better policies that would keep everyone safer in the long run.
Yeah. And I think that's the bit when people feel powerless or a bit hopeless is, well, okay, I can do a few things maybe, but those things are quite complicated. But the things that you've just listed, they're very similar to some of the things we suggest. And the other thing that we suggest to people when we talk about reducing risk is there are certain apps out there. One app that we often talk about is Yucca. I don't know if it exists in the States, but there's an app that allows you to scan a product and it gives you a rating around the chemicals, and that's really useful, particularly given that a lot of the time people don't really know what to look for. But one thing about your book is that you do end on that positive note. So stories like Barry's and Amy, who themselves have done things in their lives that both change their own perception, but also have influenced policy. And towards the end of your book, you talk about the emphasis on the power of the individual actually to make changes, not just to their own lives in terms of reducing their risk, but also the ability to push for change just in really small ways within their own community and within, the people that they know. So do you have some tips for what people can do to make those changes and to start to work towards, I suppose, demanding that government starts to improve policy?
I think the first step is letting your representatives, your lawmakers, the policymakers who represent you know that this issue is important to you, that this issue matters to the people they represent. Here in the United States, I've heard over and over again from lawmakers that it's increasingly rare for them to hear from their constituents, from the people who voted them into office and who they are charged with representing. They just don't really hear from folks often. And so if they hear from, 3 people about an issue, they assume that those 3 people represent a much larger group of the people they represent. And so something as simple as, getting in touch with your lawmakers to let them know that you want them to be thinking about policies that can prevent cancer, specifically focused on reducing harmful chemical exposures, is really meaningful. If you have, the ability to have a bigger or more ongoing conversation with decision makers, people in power about this, sometimes people are also receptive to receiving resources. You could send them a reading list. You could send them a copy of my book or other books on this topic. You could
our manifesto.
You could invite them to, educational events about this topic. And so I think that's one way to kind of start pushing for this systemic change we need to see. You mentioned those kind of 4 ways that Ami suggested we tackle this problem. And the other one is market pressure, changing the dynamics of the market. And you mentioned an app that you can scan products with. We have, I haven't heard of that one. There's one that a lot of folks use here in the United States called the Healthy Living app by the Environmental Working Group. And it's similar. You can scan a barcode or you can kind of browse by category and they give things a rating based on a long list of chemicals of concern. And one way that you can really amplify the impact of your individual shopping choices is by taking just a little extra time to let both companies know why you made a switch. So if you've been using the same hand cream your whole life because your mom used it and you like the smell and it's always been your favorite, but then you find out that it contains a bunch of potentially harmful chemicals that you'd rather not be putting on your body every day, so you switch to a different product, that company is not going to notice that one person, right? They're not going to notice on their balance sheet that one person stopped buying their product. But similar to how politicians and lawmakers rarely hear from their constituents, companies don't often hear from customers anymore either. And so they tend to take note. And so taking a few extra minutes to reach out to that company and say, I loved their product. I used it my whole life. I'm going to stop using it because it contains these ingredients that are concerning to me. And I'm switching to this brand that doesn't use these ingredients. And then also letting the new company know, thank you for making your product free of these chemicals. I'm excited to have found a healthier alternative. Can really, if these companies hear from lots of people, things along these lines, that does create a little more market pressure. And then, of course, the option to do that on social media, if that feels right to you, and if you have a social media following, that can apply even more pressure, right? Because companies are concerned about kind of how they look in the public eye. And so taking a few extra minutes when you do make those switches to let those companies know, either publicly or privately, can kind of help amplify the market impact of those individual shopping choices we make.
It's really important to not underestimate the power of the individual's voice, and often it's the loudest people who achieve change. So we just all need to realize that we can make that change if we're loud. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. That's I think I was just going to ramble on. So that's a great place to end.
Yeah, no, but it is. And we really encourage our supporters to do the same, to appreciate that actually writing to your MP, as you say, MPs don't hear about these things, so they don't think it's a problem, but it only takes 2 or 3 for them to go, oh, there's a pattern here. So important things, and what a great tip as well about writing to your, to the company that makes your favorite product if you've decided to make the switch. So all these little things have the power from the grassroots to change things, which is absolutely brilliant. And I think, to a large extent, we have to keep working to get policy change, but along the way, the grassroots movement's going to get us there as well. And it does require each individual to just do a little bit. And those tips are brilliant. I'm going to move on now to our Be Well questions. They're questions we ask everybody and not necessarily related to your work or to chemicals. First question is, do you have any guilty pleasures yourself?
I love competition shows. There are so many, I'm thinking of Glow Up, which is for makeup artists.
Oh,
and
yes.
Blown Away, which is for glass blowers, and any competition. Anytime a competition show like that comes up on Netflix, I immediately know I'm going to watch the whole thing all the way through. And I don't know, I think of that as a kind of guilty pleasure because I think of them as particularly American versions of those. They're very dramatic and they have all this faked tension and they do editing that makes it look like people are really mean to each other when actually behind the scenes they probably were polite. The British versions of those shows, actually, people are just nice to each other and it's a much more relaxing watch.
An interesting example is Traitors. I don't know if you've watched Traitors. They've got versions all over the world, and you're right, there's a real difference between the English and the American. The American version is like a stage play, It's very entertaining. So yeah, I'm with you on that one. Next question is, what is the next thing that you hope to accomplish? Now, you've done amazing work, 5 years worth of work with this. What's next on your list of things you want to accomplish?
The fun answer is travel. I love travel. I've done lots of travel, and I really want to go to Spain next to eat all the tapas and travel along the coast. I have a friend living in Barcelona right now, so I want to visit her while she's still there.
Oh, wonderful. Barcelona is a great place. And finally, is there a book or a film or a podcast that inspires you to be well?
I recently read 2 of my colleagues' books about endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I learned so much. So even having worked on this issue and written my own book, I learned so much reading their books. So if that topic is of interest, I would recommend, the first one is called Countdown, and it's by Dr. Shauna Swan, and it's about the global decline in sperm counts and increased infertility and the role that endocrine disrupting chemicals are playing in that. And the second book is called Our Stolen Future by, it's co-authored by Pete Myers, who founded Environmental Health News. And he is the scientist who actually coined the phrase endocrine disrupting chemical. And so that book is old. It was written in the early 90s. And so some of the science, has been expanded on, but I was actually shocked how relevant it still felt today and how much it kind of tells the story of the global importance of these chemicals and how it may be impacting future generations in a way that I think, most people still don't quite have a full grasp of. And it's also, he co-wrote it with a journalist. And so it's a nice, easy read. It's narrative and it's compelling. There's a lot of science in it, but it kind of reads like a mystery thriller.
Wow. Yeah. And yours does too. It's a really engaging read because it takes us on a journey. Thanks for those recommendations. We'll definitely put them in the show notes. If people want to find out more about you, where can they find out about you?
I have a website. It's KristinaMarusic.com, KristinaMarusic. Or you can go to newwaroncancer.com. That'll take you to the same website. I'm on Twitter at Kristina Writes, WRITES. And my journalism is regularly on Environmental Health News, which is ehn.org.
Great. Well, we'll make sure to include all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today, Kristina. It's been really fascinating hearing about your work. It's been great getting that insight into the US context as well for environmental chemicals and regulation. It's not that dissimilar to here, although there are some differences. I know that in the UK and especially in Europe, we have a lot more protections in place, but there's a long way to go. And the essential problems are the same, aren't they? Thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking to you too.